Thank you.
All right. In three, two.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reverend Dr. Forrest Pritchett. Uh, I'm a administrator and a faculty member at Seton Hall University, and we welcome you to this afternoon session looking at student perspectives on diversity and inclusion. One of the courses I teach at the university is called Peoples and Cultures of America. In that course, we attempt to give all students a rich and detailed understanding of all of the cultures that make up the American people. We are, in one sense, one union of people, but in another sense, we all represent many different streams uh, that come in from various countries, various nationalities, speaking different languages. And part of a sensitive perspective would be how do we encapsulate all of that as a part of the American experience? And how do we, as the Bible would dictate, how do we appreciate each other? We all are different, but in many ways we share many things that make us alike. But we need to make sure that in the American experience, the American dream is real for everybody. Um, we can think back to the founding of this country when our forefathers and one or two foremothers, if we had them in there, would have looked at how to encapsulate those beliefs from the very beginning. We can think about, for example, the preamble to the Constitution that reminds all of us that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, we ensure domestic tranquility, we provide for the common defense, we promote the general welfare, and we secure the blessings to ourselves and our posterity. We do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So, in that context of putting together our value statement, um, those men who gathered to prepare the document were probably using as a reference point the fact that in many of their countries, and if I were to use Great Britain, let's say, in the British experience as one example, you fundamentally had literally perhaps generally two classes of people historically, either a ruling elite and then everyone else who were almost the workers. And people think about kings and their territories and their authoritarian privileges as a background experience for how can we, in this new land that we are forging, how do we create something that is unique, that is different, that expresses goodwill toward all and freedom for all, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and just freedom of individual liberties. And so those paradigms should inform everything that we as a people do, except I wonder how many of us even remember those words that would make up the preamble. We could also think about, as we go on to look at the Constitution in its wonderful language, we can think about words such as we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain rights. And these rights are inalienable, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So if we put together thoughts between the preamble and the Constitution, we know that everybody had good intentions in the beginning, but the reality is, even by the time they are establishing these documents, for example, we think about this country being born as a nation. If we use the date 1776, well, let's not forget that over 270 years of history had occurred. If we go back to the first explorations in North America, going back to the 1500s, with the settling of St. Augustine, Florida, by the Spanish, and then later the Jamestown colony by the English. We look at the interactions between the indigenous populations that were already here, the indigenous nations of North America, people known by too many as Indians, although they never called themselves that. And as this country is forging itself, the whole idea of freedom, democracy, in the context of our ability to live together as one nation under God, begins to emerge. Many people in forming those documents wanted to escape the tyranny that existed in the European continent. But indeed, as we begin to look at the reality as it begins to emerge, we begin to see that as waves of immigrants begin to slowly come into the country by the early 1600s in Jamestown, and then by 1619, the emergence of Africans who were held in bondage. Then we fast forward to 1776, the emergence of the nation. And then within almost 100 years, you get the emergence of the Civil War, where we began to fight over these values. So that we begin to see that perhaps the American experiment is still in the formative stages, because as we even move into the 21st century, we can see how those basic ideals from the founding of the nation are still being challenged in the context of today's realities. So in that context, we might think about the great struggle for civil rights that begins to emerge after the Emancipation Proclamation. So we get to the latter part of the 19th century. We look at Jim Crow laws, and these are really, in one sense, contradictory to those two documents that I alluded to in the beginning. Where is the equality? Why is it that nothing is being done to facilitate the diversity of expression and the diversity and appreciation for different backgrounds? That struggle that started in the late 19th century works its way into the 20th century, and we can think about the emergence of Jim Crow laws, the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan as an organization really set and fixed on seeing to it that diversity is not being achieved, that that population that had worked in the South on those plantations would never receive full equality in this nation. We look at the early part of the 20th century, and we can see how the act of lynching was used to control, once again, the population. And then we begin to move into the events of the 1950s and the Rosa Parks, Montgomery, Alabama, and Dr. King, and all of those countless other citizens who had participated even in acts of civil disobedience even earlier than Rosa Parks. But all of this makes up that American mosaic of understanding not only the people, but how different people in different communities and coming from different backgrounds and who look different all have different worldviews. And we don't really get an opportunity to appreciate those worldviews until we can sit and begin to talk with each other, and you and I get to understand each other's worldview. Our worldview is going to be conditioned by our backgrounds, our faith statements, who we are, our gender orientations, the struggle or lack of struggle of one generation that helped us to get to this point in time. But that's all a part of our understanding of who we are. For example, if we were to take a look at the idea of what is race, what is ethnic background, what is our geographical orientation, this brings to mind what we in the social sciences would call the social construction of our individual realities. We all represent a unique coming together and an interaction and an intersection between all of the factors that make us human, which means that indeed, below the skin, we are all the same. Our skin textures may be different, but indeed, when you go to med school, once you get past the skin line, we are all basically one human race. But in that context, we all bring to the table different perspectives. And I believe that a good, comprehensive definition of diversity and inclusion just begins with understanding who we are in the fullness of our humanness. We also could look very carefully at what I would call how some others, perhaps being influenced by their experiences in Europe, came maybe in bondage, and they were indebted to someone else from Britain. But in time, many people began to develop an understanding that there were great opportunities in this new land. As W.E.B. Du Bois mentioned in his book, The Suppression of the North Atlantic Slave Trade, there were great profits that could be made in this nation. And some people then began to nurture this notion that indeed, perhaps they could become rich. But in becoming rich, believe it or not, laws were written that only allowed certain people to literally have access to own property. White males, for example, who wanted to be literally those who controlled most of the economic activity in this country, saw to it that codes were being written during the colonial period, for example, that limited access to owning property to only some few males, not all white males. And even white women were not allowed to even own property, nor were they able to attend school. These are very interesting elements of the emergence of a sense of power and privilege. So that, for example, if we were to look at a wheel which some scientists have developed, it would show you how complex these are not simple issues. But when we look at what the nature of power and privilege is in America and how it manifests itself, you can see it's a very complicated discussion. For example, a text by Eisenberg talks about very provocative title of her book, White Trash, which begins to look at that period where the laws were being written to see to it that the full freedom that was promised in the American dream would not be manifested to all people who happen to be white. So we could also say therefore, that there's a lot of diversity in the white experience in America. Because often when people think about diversity, they really are only thinking about that great divide between perhaps what is white and what would be considered black, or Caucasians and African Americans. And as we would move on from that point, we could even see how the power of the population that was dominant in this nation even controlled the way in which they looked at those who were in bondage, so that we could trace literally the labeling of a population by the power of another group. So, for example, Caucasians could look at those in bondage in the fields, and instead of calling them by their African names or identifying them by their African characteristics, simply use words that start with the letter N, and none of that is considered to be positive at all, but very negative. But the word Negro even comes out of that construction of identity for this imprisoned population. So that it's really not until literally the 1960s that the Negro who was insulted when he is called black, when he is called nigger, as such, And as a result of the civil rights struggle, that person, that group, in order to develop their personhood, begins to redefine their circumstances legally and then redefine their circumstances in terms of their cognitive psychology of themselves, so that they then begin to relabel themselves. So they take a word like black, which normally would imply something negative, and turn that into something powerful. And so a statement like black is beautiful begins to emerge. A lot of people who are not of African descent don't understand the term, but then the term is meant to empower folks. Then we move on to another stage that emerges by the 70s and 80s, where the Negro, who now is saying black is beautiful, is now saying things like we are Afro-Americans. We could not use the term African Americans quite yet because many people did not understand fully a lot about Africa at all. So it took a while before any African Americans as such began to even use the term and feel comfortable with talking about themselves and referring to themselves as African Americans. So there we've already gone through how power and privilege can impact an understanding of diversity in the context of even how people can view others. So with all of that being said, I would probably like to take a look at the diversity iceberg that has been generated in the social science community. In the iceberg, we can see very clearly, if you look at the positioning of the ice in relationship to the water, that in most cases, the portions of the ice which are lower than the water level would simply indicate to us that if people only deal with any of us looking at surface issues, then indeed they only see a portion of who we are, and they are not gathering the full impact of our humanity, our whole experience. How do we see the world? What do we have in common? Until we begin to have these dialogues, we'll never really understand fully the humanness of others. If we let other people influence our thoughts and minds to the extent to which anyone closes down their mind to understanding other people. This is the mechanisms wherein prejudice, discrimination, and racism can begin to emerge, or even sexism. So this is highly appropriate that we all understand that we need to spend time together in fellowship. But one of the hardest conversations there is to have in America is the conversation around race. And I would hope that in an institution of higher learning that we can begin to, and as always, have more time to not only have these conversations, but I think it's almost a sin for any college or university to actually graduate folks into the world today who are supposedly competent in a major discipline, yet and still we show a high degree of incompetence around the issue of having conversations that are open-minded around the issues of race, diversity, and inclusion. So with that in mind, we have at least three models that we will be holding up before you this afternoon. We have gathered together three students who will be taking a look at perhaps three approaches that will hopefully enlighten us in our pursuit of looking at diversity and inclusion. One of our first students is going to be looking at the work of other scholars looking at least one group, ethnic group that we may know very little about, but in the context of understanding the mechanisms for prejudice and hatred. Then you look at the emerging pandemic in this country, and lo and behold, while we're dealing with objectively scientific reality of virus and the need to control it, lo and behold, out of the American experience and the American experiment comes that old-fashioned hatred once again. And we'll see how that becomes manifested when Megan brings about her presentation looking at Chinese Americans. Then Zach will be talking to us about looking at how things can change. Look at the history and the vitality of social movements which have been afoot in this land. I know many people, when they think about social movements, they often, their mindset closes down around the issue very quickly. But the reality is, America is brought about by a social movement. America is sustained and gets better through the various social movements that begin to emerge. And so we're pretty, we need to look very objectively at the role of social change versus maintaining the status quo. And then lastly, Taylor, one of our preeminent, about to graduate servant leaders at the university, will take us through her journey with struggling with these issues over her 4 years at the university, and the kind of things, activities she's been involved with, the various committees, what all of that has involved, and perhaps what price she has had to pay for that in terms of her own emotional development. So at this point, I'm going to ask each of our students to identify themselves for our audience, but we're going to ask Megan to now start her presentation. Thank you very much.
Alrighty. Hello. My name is Megan Ogilvie, and I will be presenting on Chinese Americans. I am a senior here at Seton Hall University. I am a double major in history and Asian studies. I'm from San Diego, California, and I came here to New Jersey to experience East Coast culture. I've had a great time here at Seton Hall. About to graduate this May. And I have accepted a position as a JET assistant language position that I'll be starting in September, teaching English in Japan. So now to start my presentation, let me just share my PowerPoint with everyone. Alrighty. So the book that I read for Dr. Pritchett's class this semester was My Journey to Becoming Chinese American, a memoir of an Asian American psychologist and his search for ethnic identity. This book is by Dr. Xiun Andrew Chen. He details his experience growing up in China to the time that he moves into the United States for his higher education and graduate school. So to begin, I just am giving you guys a chapter breakdown. I've split this book into 7 different sections. The first section is about his life in China, which I'll be going over very briefly, as this presentation is about Chinese Americans and what they go through in America today. And the second section is about his early academia, so graduate schools and his early years in teaching. The next section is on his activism, his early activism. And then next, a section that I will not be speaking on today. However, if you do get the opportunity to read this book, I highly recommend it, is his advocacy within China of psychology. The next section would be just more in depth about what the issues that face Chinese Americans are, and what actions he takes to improve life for Chinese Americans. And then the next section is more on the actual organizations that he partners with and uses to advocate for Chinese Americans. And then finally, we have a little more about himself, his retirement, and his inspiration for writing this book. To start with, his early childhood and education in China and Taiwan. So he was born in 1931, right in the midst of World War II and the Asia-Pacific War. He experienced a lot of very traumatizing things in China. He experienced the invasion of the Japanese into China, and he experienced the fight between the nationalists and the communists to rule the country, essentially. So he was born in Xinhua, which is along the Yangtze River, and he split his childhood between here and a city called Zhenjiang, which is where he completed most of his education. He went to a boarding school in Zhenjiang, but unfortunately, due to the Communist Revolution, he couldn't graduate. He still had like 3 months left of his education, and so he had to move to Taiwan and finish up high school in Taiwan. From there, he went to Taiwan's Teacher College, which is now called Taiwan Normal University, and he completed his bachelor's degree there. After he gets his degree in Taiwan, his lifelong dream had been to complete his education in the United States. He travels to America from Taiwan by boat, which takes a very long time, and he missed the first month and a half of school. Now he went to University of Oregon, and got his Master's of Science in Education and a minor in psychology. From there, he moved on to Columbia University and got his Master's of Arts in Psychology and his PhD in Education Development. He talks about his time in grad school, and he loves it. People are kind, people help him with the language. He tells us one story of a student. He was so surprised at how kind Americans were within the world of grad school and university, because this man would sit with him after every single class and go through the lectures with him and see if there was anything he misunderstood. And then he moves to Kansas to be a professor at Emporia University and to lead the department on diversity in education. This is where he first really experiences any racism or recognizes any racism. People may have made comments towards him before and he didn't really recognize it. So the first time that he experiences any microaggressions in Kansas is when a professor friend of his that he was talking to is talking, and he's joking around. He's like, "Oh, Chen, you don't have a Chinaman's chance." And he looks back at the professor and he goes, "But I am a Chinaman." And the professor is clearly uncomfortable, and he goes, "Oh, that's just a saying that we say here in America." And I'm not realizing that it's actually very derogatory. And then another time is when Dr. Chen mentions to a biology professor that carp in China are like a delicacy, and then these two ginormous fish, way too big to eat or to do anything with, are left outside his front door. Dr. Chen says that to this day he's not sure if it was a friendly joke or if it was an aggressive prank. So moving on from Emporia State University, he is hired at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania. Here is where he starts his true activism and promotion for minorities. His educational activism includes bilingual education. He's a very strong proponent of bilingual education. He wants there to be a lot more support for children who do not speak English that well to learn English so that they're able to succeed in the classroom, and for there to be opportunities for classes to be taught in their native languages. He is a very strong proponent of an individual approach to education. Like I said, he does have his PhD in educational development, and a lot of education scholars notice that children and adults in classrooms tend to thrive when their learning goals are molded to their specific needs, rather than having overarching education goals. So yeah, and then next, he's a part of several state government education boards and diversity and inclusion boards. Some of these boards include the Multicultural Education Board in Pennsylvania during the 80s and 90s, the Asian American Task Force, whose goal, who gathered data to fight myths about Chinese and Asian Americans, the Committee on Intergroup Behavior on campus. So they did many surveys across state universities in Pennsylvania to get statistics on violence towards minorities. And then in creating connections, so these he promoted Chinese schools, which are after school kind of language and culture schools, Chinese community centers. He's a strong proponent of Chinese community centers, and diversity and inclusion boards. So he talks about, he calls it interracial discomfort in Butler, Pennsylvania during the late 1980s and 90s. He mentions children making slant-eyed gestures. A Boy Scout later is saying that his son is Chinese, and his son talks back and says, "I'm an American," and gets in trouble. And then many people question Dr. Chen's Catholic name, Andrew. He goes by Andrew in general circles, and they question it, and he says, "Well, I'm a Catholic, so my Catholic name is Andrew." And Chinese parents calling the participation in American culture hypocrisy. This was a big issue that Dr. Chen talked about, is that even within Chinese culture, the sort of separatism and seeing yourself as an other is a big issue, and causes a lot of pain in Chinese children. And he suggests that parents really embrace the multicultural nature of America, rather than just putting themselves apart as Chinese, as well as others putting them apart as Chinese. And then Chinese children that attend Chinese schools have higher esteem than that of native Latin American, African American counterparts, however, still significantly lower than white American children. A lot of this has to do with the reinforcement of culture and language that they get at Chinese schools, which is very popular for parents to send their children to these Chinese schools. They get that reinforcement of language and culture and see value within themselves, more than that of their native Latin and African American counterparts. Chinese schools, student self-identity. He did a survey among the children that attended their local Chinese school in Butler, Pennsylvania in the 80s and 90s, and noticed that only that 50% of those students considered themselves Chinese American. 37% saw themselves as American Chinese, and 12% saw themselves as strictly Chinese. And so this brings up the issue of social isolation of Chinese and minority students. The issues are the lack of role models for children in the community, pressure to be translators as well as children and students, the culture gap between more traditional parents and mainstream American culture, and discrimination at universities. So the solutions to the first one, Dr. Chen proposes that getting involved in the community as adults and parents and becoming those public role models for their children could be a great help. He proposes that bilingualism, speaking both English and Chinese at home, would allow those children to have more space to be children, and form their identities within the greater American culture as well as their Chinese culture. And then the next point, the culture gap between more traditional parents and mainstream American culture. This is a direct quote from Dr. Chen. He says, Chinese American kids should know that it's okay to not solely be Chinese or solely American, and they can define their own social identity. So really having parents reinforce the idea that you don't have to be solely Chinese or you don't have to be solely American. It's okay to mix those identities within yourself. And then discrimination at universities is a big thing that he goes on about in this book. So there was a yes, so this was when he was a part of the Committee on Intergroup Behavior on campus, and he and this group conducted a survey across all of the state universities and private universities in Pennsylvania. Most of the state universities, actually all of the state universities responded, and most of the private universities did as well. And they reported that 32 to 49% of the institutions that participated did not have any written policies regarding hate activities in the 1990s. And furthermore, 44% of the on-campus security officials had not had any training since 1988 in dealing with intergroup relations. This survey was given out in 1992, so that's more than 3 years since the last training on diversity and inclusion was given. So he promotes more diversity and inclusion initiatives within the university community, because the universities are usually where these sorts of movements start. And these are his more recent activities. This picture here is Dr. Xiu Andrew Chen, so he analyzes in this book a 2013 survey, Pew Research survey, that states that Chinese Americans are more isolated than other Asian Americans, and they're also the top overqualified and underpaid people within America. They often have extremely high levels of education, but due to the model minority myth, they're underpaid and undervalued as employees and faculty. So in the book, he talks about these statistics, and here it says that so only 18% of Chinese Americans relate well to other Asian American groups, as well as Latino, African Americans, and other minority groups within the United States. He says that this data shows a clear pattern of detachment by Chinese Americans from both white and economic groups. And he says that if one wants to be accepted by others, you must first accept them. And I think we've seen great strides by the Asian American community in recent years. This book was published in 2017, but since 2017, I think we have seen great strides in the Chinese American community to reach out into the public, and they started to become much more accepted until recent events. We'll go over that later, but I want to continue with this model minority myth. So this model minority myth, you may be thinking, okay, so people think that Asian Americans are good at math. What's the big deal there? The big deal there is that because of this model minority myth, it causes a lack of resources in school. Teachers see Asian students and they think, oh, they're hardworking, they'll understand later. They don't get the support that they need. As well as on page 147, he mentions that the United States Health Organization declined to give health grants to the study of the health of Asian Americans because they're seen as, oh, healthy. They're the good minority. They're good at that. They're good at exercising. They're very intelligent. So it's not necessary to investigate any health issues among them, which is extremely dangerous. And then he goes over the idea of the Chinese Americans being the model minority. What does that mean? Model means superior. And so they're superior, right? And then minority means disadvantage. They're the superior disadvantage. And Dr. Chen states that he wants more for his people than that. He wants to be more than a superior disadvantaged. He wants them to be able to just be themselves. So some of the organizations that Dr. Chen has been a part of is the Organization of Chinese Americans, the Asian American Psychology Association, and many other national organizations. He's written many letters to politicians and public figures fighting against the use of racial slurs towards Asian Americans and African Americans. And all that. So why is this relevant today? Well, right now during this COVID-19 during the COVID-19 quarantines and things like that, people are blaming Chinese Americans, although one's race has absolutely nothing to do with the contraction of any sort of this disease. People are blaming Asian Americans and assaulting them in the streets. And it goes to show that the progress that we thought we were making certainly is not sticking. All right, thank you very much.
All right, Megan, thank you very much. Now we're going to move on to Zach, who is going to give us a case study through his reading of how change comes about in America through the concerted efforts of those who gather together, who've identified a problem, and who have a solution in mind. All right, Zach, please introduce yourself to everybody.
Hello, my name is Zachary Gushler. I'm currently a freshman at Seton Hall University, and my major is sustainability. I read the book The Critical Mind by Zoe McGee, and I really hope you enjoy my presentation. So, I read The Critical Mind by Zoe McGee, and basically the book was about her interactions with critical thinking, and it really made me think, especially after reading it, about my life and everything that's going on in the world today that people could benefit from critical thinking. Thought process is definitely something that comes to mind when dealing with racial disputes and stereotypes, and even the coronavirus outbreak. So maybe when looking at all this media and all the other things in your life, try to critical think, and I'm going to try to help you, give you the steps necessary to do that. So in order to look at critical thinking, we need to look at the qualities of a critical thinker. And really, you need to be curious of what's going on in your life and what's happening around you, and that can be easier said than done, because sometimes in life you don't want to question the things around you because it's scary. I know that I am definitely shortening myself of the news lately because of the coronavirus. I don't want to give myself all that media because it is scary. But while that's happening, there also has to be the other side of people that are trying to help everyone in this world, and they're the ones who have to ask these types of questions. Now, while these other people are asking these questions, you can ask yourself the question of what can better your life at home.
Zach,
yeah.
Zach, this is Dr. Pritchard. Just take a moment to launch your presentation. That way, I think it would fill the whole screen up just for aesthetic.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. Thank you, sir.
So back to what I was saying, definitely taking a second inside in our lives to really be skeptic and seek out the truth, because a lot of fake news can come from a lot of different sources, and when just talking with your friends on the phone or family members, try to always seek the truth, because some facts can be very scary. Now, when critical thinking, it can be very, very hard to know something and wanting to get your opinion out, but not knowing the right time. And something that Zoe McGee said in the book, that the difference is between a critical thinker that's a nice person and a critical thinker that's not a nice person is kindness. So she used a story in her book about her grandmother, and her grandmother was a very happy lady, knowing that she loved cotton. She said cotton is the best material possible for clothes to be made out of. It's the best on your skin. It's the best for you no matter what. Now, as science gets to, advance, we know that materials like polyester and other materials may be better for some people, maybe who have eczema or who are sweating more in athletics. Now, what kind of person would you be if you told a sweet old grandma who loves cotton that, that's not the best? That's not true. There's no need in her life for her to know, this. So maybe it's better off if we take some humility and back off. Now, the next thing to look at when critical thinking is going to be the stages of human cognition. And this was definitely, I would say, one of the most important chapters of the book, because it really showed how people and the stages of their life differ in knowledge. So a 2- and 7-year-old have the same info about the world. The difference is how they perceive it. And Zoe McGee was going on in her book about Jean Pagnot's study. And Jean Pagnot did a series of studies to figure out the stages of life of human cognition. The thing that was really bolded to me was that definitely this differentiating in 2- and 7-year-old. How could a 2- and 7-year-old have the same knowledge about the world? How could that be possible? And then she went on to tell a story. So a 2-year-old is very egocentric. They want all the toys, even though they have siblings. It doesn't matter. They cannot understand why they should give up their toys, why they should give a part of their enjoyment. They don't have to in their heads. But now a 7-year-old, even though they're in the same stage of human cognition, their brain somewhat similarly developed, their parents have now influenced them about sharing and about the perspectives of other people. So when that boy, that girl is looking at their toy, and now they're thinking about their sibling, they say, okay, you can have one of my toys now, because I don't want you to cry. I don't want you to be upset. While we can move on from that, and after they start growing up, 2 to 7, 7 to 11, and then finally 12 on. 12 is the last stage, and to me that was very surprising, because I thought there were way more stages in human cognition. It said that people shouldn't consume alcohol substance till they're 21 because their brain, stops developing. And I was wondering why this didn't stop at 21. But she was actually talking about here the stages that the brain can comprehend something. And it's not until 12 years old that you can really start understanding these abstract ideas. And the example that she used in this is Jean Pagnot's study, where she had a whole bunch of children of all different ages, and she gave them a whole bunch of scales with weights on them. And she asked the students, the children, to even out the scale. In order to do this, they would, go through trial and error and put 5 to 10 pounds each on the scale, trying to make it as even as possible. But it wasn't until a 12-year-old that they could form a hypothesis so that the scale would always be balanced. After human Cognition, we're going to take a look at 7 steps to critical thinking in anyone's daily life. While as I get older, I will continue to, ask better and better questions. I'm definitely not a master at all, but I did figure out quite a few things from the book, and the things that stood out for me were the assumptions and biases, emotional reasoning, and overgeneralization. These are the things in our society today that are definitely some of the causes of some racism and stereotypes that a lot of people have to deal with. Overgeneralization of any minority group can lead to racial disputes, and the reason behind this is that people don't understand. They don't want to go look more in depth. It is easier to take the opinion of another fellow friend or someone that you trust, even if they are racist, than forget what they said and form your own knowledge about it. The human race is very, very held on to its beliefs, and it's very hard for them to forget the things they know and move on. So when we do critical think, we have to look at these steps so that we can evolve and become more united as a species, as the United States, as a world, as people. Then the next thing is that thinking can cost you time and money. And it is definitely true, because I know that I can sometimes lay awake at night thinking about a problem that I may have had during the day. And I'm thinking about this problem, I'm thinking about it, and maybe it was about buying something on Amazon that I may need for a class. I might make the impulse decision just to buy that so I can get some rest. With critical thinking, it might be easier to take everything that you have, go back to the steps, and look at the steps compared to the question you have at hand to save you some time. When dealing with critical thinking, you always want to try to consider concepts like clarity, accuracy, relevance, and precision. You should try to consider everyone's perspective. Next are going to be the elements of critical thinking. These are the things that are under the steps, the things that people look at in order to form critical thinking when it wasn't even a word yet. And if you find yourself in a very difficult situation, these are the things that you should come back to as your foundation. So we've said questioning many times, and assumptions are going to be the thing that really get in the way of your critical thinking skill. Humans cannot learn enough information in this world, as there is just so much, and in everyone's 100 years of life, I don't think it's possible to know everything. And that's why people love to make inferences and they love to make assumptions, because it's easier to have, your time. You are keeping your time. But instead of doing that, critical thinking can allow you to really find out what is true about the world. Next, I know it is easy to say that you are going to critical think and you are going to do this, but it is hard. You have to question your assumptions. You have to question the things that you hold to yourself. I know that for me, I'm very, I'm a confident person. I really want to always stand by what I say because I believe it is in the best interest of me and other people around me. But sometimes I have to look inward and I have to say, that was wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I need to switch. Maybe I need to do something else with my project, presentation, people, group. You don't want to be an absolute, diplomat. You want to be real with people. You want to allow yourself to dive out into the world and surround yourself with people smarter than you while asking questions and acquiring answers without bias. And then the next thing we're going to look at is the thinking blockades. This guy is from the show Inside Out, and honestly, I really do feel like that sometimes when I'm very angry in an argument. His name is Anger, I'm pretty sure. But while this is a pretty cartoony slide, it's actually a very serious topic. Everyone is only human, and some people can be egocentric and sociocentric, and there are injustices that we face every single day. A lot of people deal with prejudice because of fear. People are lazy and prideful. There is peer pressure going on in a lot of teenage groups with vaping and smoking and a whole bunch of other drugs. And something that I found really interesting that could be a thinking blockade was wishful thinking that everything's always going to be okay. If you are trying to find something out, if you're trying to go through a problem in your life and you are always wishful thinking, it is always good to have courage. But Zoe McGee said that wishful thinking can lead to a sugar-coated outcome. It can lead you to sugarcoat yourself and to not almost lie to yourself to say that everything's going to be okay. Sometimes we have to look at the hard, brute facts. Now, I'm looking at, let's say a family dispute, and I'm just so angry with my siblings or my parents that I cannot decide justly what to do in that situation. And that is the time that you should be taking and recognizing your hate and your anger and taking a step back, going to your room, not confronting it that right moment, and taking your critical thinking skills to analyze what to do. The next thing we're going to be looking at is how critical thinking can better your life. So the more you question your life, the more you will understand, and that is just a true topic that everyone knows. But if you go up to your professor after a class and you ask questions, you are going to be the one who knows a little bit more than everyone else in the class who just listened to that lecture. Go the extra mile, and that's what critical thinking really is. It's going that extra mile in your thought process. But while critical thinking is the extra mile right now, it should be the foundation. If there were more critical thinkers in the world, we wouldn't have so many racial disputes and stereotypes, because people would dive deeper. But it is this laziness that people have, that when they are confronted with any opinion or thing that they might think is a fact, that they don't want to look more deep into it. And while knowledge seems to be infinite, no one knows everything. So maybe when you're questioning life, you have to understand that there is uncertainty, and there always will be. No one is always going to have all the answers. Things you see or read may not make sense, so research and find out yourself the mysteries in the world. Anyone can critical think, and there is no reason why you shouldn't, besides time. So if you have the time, and if you are willing, you should always try to critical think in your life when you have the chance to try to stop some of the hatred going around. Thank you very much.
Zach, we want to thank you very much for helping to stimulate our imagination and really helping us to understand also that probably one thing that one model that we can see active in American life is that when other people can get us to think one way and we are not a critical thinker, then it's easier for us to lay back in that comfort zone and never challenge anything we see, never develop any critical perspective. So I think we want to thank you very much for you have, in a sense, indicated that more of us have to learn how to execute our constitutional privilege of speaking up, acting up, and pointing out when things need to be changed, and not having others to form all of our opinions. We want to thank you very much for that. And we hope that you planted seeds in the life of many students and faculty alike seeds of change in how we think. Now we're going to move on to Taylor, who has been a very active student leader who is looking, like Megan, to graduate very soon and share her gifts with the world. Taylor, can you please take over?
Hi, everybody. I'm just trying to get the presentation set up. Sorry.
Why don't you tell us about who you are, if you can talk and push buttons at the same time?
Yeah, okay, sorry. So my name is Taylor Newkirk. I'm currently a senior psychology major with a minor in Africana Studies. And after graduation, I'm going to be going to the University of Maryland College Park for public policy.
Thank you, Taylor, very much.
No problem. So let me just get this going.
And don't forget to share your screen and to launch it
Yeah.
so that it goes full screen, okay?
Yeah.
While Taylor is putting everything in place, we hope everyone is enjoying and appreciating listening to and watching our students. This is the fruit of our labors, and we are looking forward to great things from all of them in the future. It looks like Taylor's ready to go. Thank you, Taylor.
Okay, no problem. So today I'm going to be discussing servant leadership and diversity and inclusion matters. I'm going to try to be as concise and brief as possible. I'm going to give you like a couple of reasons for why it's important to be discussing servant leadership today and how it is involved in diversity and inclusion. And then at the end, I'll begin to talk about my involvement with diversity and inclusion at Seton Hall for the past 4 years. So to begin, servant leadership is really, in a way, self-explanatory. The definition is really in the term. As a servant leader, someone is expected to have moral authority. So yes, you do technically hold power over a group of people that you are leading. But while you have a certain goal in mind for your group, for your organization, whatever it is that you're leading, it's very important to think about the greater good in a way. As a servant leader, you're also expected to be one amongst your people. There's not necessarily that traditional idea of leadership where the leader is at the top and then overseeing everybody else in their group. The leader sometimes, well, normally in servant leadership is among everybody and on the same level as everybody. So for a lot of members of that group, they are able to access the leader very easily, and the leader is always communicating with the people in their cohort. And then as a result of that, the leader is expected to be able to put their people before themselves. So, you know, as people, we all have personal goals, we have personal initiatives that we want to put on and personal opinions, but then a lot of times we have to sacrifice our personal preferences for the whole picture. And in order to do that, it does take a lot of empathy, and it takes a lot of selflessness and being able to put yourself in the position of the people that you're leading, and the people, not just the people that you're leading directly, but then also the people who are being impacted by your organization and the leadership that you're executing for that organization. Today, servant leadership is very, very important when we look at a society that is normally led by people who, in my opinion, tend to have their own personal goals in mind, yes, but then you see on a political scale and even at Seton Hall, you see like administrators and then people with like the top power tend to kind of seek out opportunities that benefit them more so. And then a lot of the times, like even with the initiatives looking good at face value or to people who are looking from the outside, the people who are being directly impacted, so for a university, the students or like the faculty members, those people who are being impacted directly by that leadership sometimes are the ones who are not truly benefiting, and then like it just looks good for like publicity and things like that. So today, to be a servant leader gives you that opportunity to prime other student leaders and servant leaders and things like that, you have that opportunity to influence people from within. So for me, for example, as a mentor in a lot of organizations that I'm in, I'm working directly with students and like giving them guidance to the best of my ability, just naturally. But then as a result of that, my hope is that the students become more inspired within themselves to go further and to become servant leaders themselves and like kind of like make what they see, what I do and what other student leaders do into their own, and then help possibly go into other communities that they know that they can help, and then continue the same trend, which is making progress in that community specifically. And then, as I said already about mentoring, right now, there also seems to be a great amount of people who are kind of doing things for themselves, if that makes sense. Like people are seeking opportunities to become the owner of something. People are seeking opportunities to make something for themselves, like establish their own organizations. People are hoping to make a name for themselves. But then a lot of the times, because we're focusing on like getting ahead on our own, we tend to forget about the people who are coming up after us. And if we don't take care of the people who are coming up after us, that would be like the youth in this case, there's a very high likelihood that in the future, they might not know how to continue to be proper leaders, or there's a chance that our society could start to slightly collapse because there wasn't proper mentoring and there wasn't proper like passing down of information and knowledge as servant leaders can do. And that also goes into social inspiration for others. Like it's just a kind of natural thing that happens as a servant leader, because a lot of times servant leadership just comes from within. A lot of servant leaders just have the natural talent to serve, but then also lead. And a lot of times that comes from them having a mentor who's done the same thing for them. And I know that that was the case for me. I was raised in a place where I was given a lot of opportunities to join programs that would advance my education and also advance my like teamwork skills and things like that. And as a result of being in those organizations, I was inspired by a lot of my mentors or a lot of the older people around me to continue to do the same thing that they do. And then eventually the hope of servant leadership is moral development in social and in societal and political issues. So basically what that would look like is a slight shift in societal dynamics and political dynamics. A lot of times you see politicians going by the book, and you see people like doing things based on tradition, yes, and then like just what we were taught that society was supposed to be. And a lot of times you hear people say, like for example, the current president, when he was running, a lot of people would say like, oh, he's a businessman, like he's just working as if this were a business, and they would say that as if it were a positive thing. But in my mind, to run a business or to lead a country or to even be a teacher, to be an educator, to be an administrator of an organization, that does not require you to be asympathetic, and it requires a little bit more empathy than I believe we're giving. And I feel like that is a result of a lack of servant leadership and a lack of being amongst the people that you're trying to make a change for. If we as a society continue to promote servant leadership and continue to like truly communicate with one another and be like involved with one another truly in order to make that progress, I definitely think that morals and things like that could truly be like intertwined into what's going on in our politics. And then continuing, just going into diversity and inclusion, the main goal of many organizations that have lately been trying to promote diversity and inclusion, and you see this at Seton Hall with a lot of their initiatives, would be establishing ones that cover most marginalized groups. And I say most because a lot of the times when speaking of diversity, a lot of people automatically think about race or they automatically think about sex, but there's so much more within marginalized groups or like just oppressed people than race or sex. And sometimes because of all of the vast like diversity like within us as people, sometimes it's hard to tap on or like acknowledge all of the different groups who need attention right now and who need that acknowledgement. Diversity and inclusion initiatives also provide opportunities for we as marginalized people to be represented. in a lot of situations and in a lot of regular organizations that don't always have diversity and inclusion initiatives, you hear about people who are part of a minority. So like, for example, I can say like for some Black people I know, they say that they experience racism or just like insensitivity. And a lot of times it's just because of a lack of education or a lack of ignorance within that organization, because diversity and inclusion specifically to recognize the oppression that people have gone through, and then also to like try to alleviate what was recognized is not always practiced. Once people start to include diversity and inclusion in their initiatives, then that may start to change. And then it allows marginalized people to be given a seat at the table. And what that looks like is really just participating and like showing up to certain meetings where people are discussing, you know, how are we going to contribute to this specific community? How are we going to help like these people in our organization and things like that? You can't fully help these people if you don't have advocates or liaisons from that group coming and advocating for them with that seat at the table. Once they get the seat at the table, there's an opportunity, and this is like from more of a university perspective, from my experience, once you give people the seat at the table, there's an opportunity for new programs and events to occur that actually have representation of people from different marginalized groups in them. So you would see a shift in the dynamic of the programs that are being presented. You'll probably see a shift in the people who are giving the presentations. You'll probably see a shift in the discussions being had and actually acknowledging why the discussion is changing. And then, like I said, just general acknowledgement. In a lot of cases, you hear about people from marginalized groups like crying out and demanding certain things. And a lot of it is really just stemming from a lack of acknowledging what these people are going through and then following up with ways to fix the situations that they're in. So then this is like finally my last slide is just going to be talking about diversity and inclusion in academia. And then, like I said, it's really from my experience at Seton Hall. The best thing or the best way to get involved as a servant leader around Seton Hall's area would be like focusing more so on the places that don't always get that attention. A lot of times, and I know that they're trying to alleviate this stigma, for example, but sometimes like, I don't know if you guys have heard, but like there would be a saying, you know, like if you're white, don't go right and stuff like that, or like just telling people not to go into Newark because it's a dangerous area, when really, you know, just in my opinion, being like safe and practical, practicing that anywhere you go is going to benefit you regardless of where you're at. Of course, depending on where you are, especially if you don't know the community that you're in, it's important to be like aware and just on your toes, like in that community. But because of the fear that's instilled in people because of a lack of education and a lack of understanding of those groups, marginalized communities directly next to Seton Hall are being neglected by us. And it's important for us as servant leaders, and if you're interested in servant leadership, it's important for you to really, really focus on the cries of the people that you're trying to advocate for and the cries of the people that you're working with directly. Because if you're saying one thing, in my eyes, if you're saying one thing, like you're trying to promote one goal for a group of people, but you haven't necessarily spoken with those people, or you haven't necessarily understood and empathized to an extent, like with what they're going through, it's going to be very, very difficult to make something great for them. And you can have the best of intentions with what you're doing and with the initiatives that you're implementing at whatever organization you're dealing with, but there's a great chance that you'll still see dissatisfaction within those groups of people. And I see that, like, for example, I sit on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at Seton Hall, and a lot of times prior to this school year, I feel like this past school year with Dr. Cooper Gibson, the new VP of Student Services, things have been changing a lot. But prior to that, you would hear administrators speaking to one another and faculty members speaking with one another, trying to figure out, you know, how can we make Seton Hall a better place for our community members? How can we make Seton Hall a better place for the students, for the faculty members, and everything like that? And then they would have like a couple of students in the room. The students would try to speak up, but then you would see the results, which would be things that the students didn't necessarily say, like, this is what we want. These are things that will make us more comfortable and feel included at the school. So a lot of times, like even with the seat at the table, it goes back to that acknowledgement and recognition, like I said before, in order to truly like do things practically for the people that you're trying to do them for. Another great way to be a servant leader, like I said before, is just mentoring people, just going out and like giving what you learned from whatever experiences that you have, be they general life experiences, be they educational experiences, social, political, anything like that, just giving it back. Because a lot of times, like just having a general conversation with somebody can literally flip their mindset and might have a great impact on them. Right before I got on this live, and before I had my class, I was actually doing work for the Center for Community Research and Engagement, because we mentor middle schoolers. And for a lot of those students, the only opportunity that they have to like truly like express themselves and try to like build themselves as people would be in school, and then at this after school program. So like right now with the pandemic occurring, you know, we can't really do anything, but it's still important for us to like make sure these students know, like, as your mentor, I'm still here for you regardless of this stuff. So we're like writing letters to the students, and like it's simple things like that that can literally like shift one student's mindset. And then a lot of times, like we've seen these students, and I've been working with CCRE for the past 4 years, we've seen a lot of these students turn around and become student leaders themselves, become very successful in high school, and so much more. And then when it comes to advocacy, like I've been saying this whole time as well, as an advocate for any group of people, anything that you're advocating for, it's very, very important that you interact with the people that you're advocating for, or with the group that you're advocating for. Because if you're at the top and not amongst the people, then it's very, very difficult to truly communicate what these people need. And then it's difficult to continue having the support of your followers. Because even as a servant leader, having followers and having people who support you is always going to be important. That's always something that leaders think about, you know, like, am I doing the right thing for my followers? Am I doing what's best for them beyond what I think? That's the way that a servant leader thinks. That's what the difference is. It's not just, am I maximizing all of our resources, you know, if that makes sense. And then like, I'll just go into Seton Hall specific. If you don't want to search for things on your own, like going out into the community, which you definitely can do, and like reaching out and networking with people on your own, and like finding ways to become a mentor on your own, you can go through these outlets. So I've been a part of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee since 2018, and I've seen it grow, and I've seen it develop into what it is today. It's gone from like being just something that takes a survey for students to see like what really they want, and then like leaving the survey, to actually doing like physical things and like making concrete plans for moving forward for the student body and for the employees of Seton Hall. And like doing that as a servant leader, it's important because like you have that opportunity to truly speak with the people that you're advocating for. I was a student liaison, so basically, because I was a part of so many different student organizations and I knew so many people, I was able to speak with them and truly like understand what we as students might need, like as a majority, even if it didn't necessarily satisfy everybody. And then I would bring it back to the committee. And while it was difficult sometimes to get a point across, you still do it because that's what you do as a leader, and that's what you do for your people. There's also the Strategic Planning Committee, which is like an adjacent to the Diversity and Inclusion Committee now. And I believe that was established by Dr. Cooper Gibson. Sometimes I kind of get those mixed up, but the Strategic Planning Committee is more like direct with everything that the Diversity and Inclusion Committee focuses on. And it's like more like top work. So while you're still interacting with like all your constituents and everything, you go back to administration specifically and like speak about ways to truly like establish different things for students to make them more comfortable at the school. So like having different committees within the Strategic Planning Committee to focus on different things. I think that was a very, very good opportunity if people want to take advantage of that. My biggest passion throughout my Seton Hall experience would be working for CCRE. and being the president of the Black Student Union. So CCRE to me was the best opportunity at Seton Hall because that was the only time that I truly got the opportunity to go to the right and to go into communities that people stigmatize so much, to the point of not really wanting to go. From my freshman year, or like at the beginning of my freshman year, a lot of times like I would hear, my own peers who would go and do the community service with us, kind of like speak down on the communities that we would go into, and it would frustrate me. But at this point now, it's just, beyond like, you could say like someone is just ignorant and things like that, but it's really like a lack of understanding of those people. And sometimes like, even if you're a servant leader and like you might feel like negative toward a community, I feel like that goes to show that that's not the community that you should probably be advocating for. Because like I felt so passionately about these communities that people kind of looked down on. I stayed with CCRE for my 4 years at Seton Hall and continued to do service in different middle schools and different daycares. You as a servant leader with CCRE have the opportunity to like pick and choose kind of what communities we're going into and like where we're helping. And it's always an amazing feeling to like be a part of that and to see like the impact that you're literally having on people in real time. Like every week there's something different. And even if it's not, that something's going on, at least the interaction happened. And CCRE is continuing to grow, and I always promote it to people because I believe that that was truly one of the biggest things that made me specifically a servant leader. I have a lot of experience as a general leader, but servant leadership is always promoted in CCRE. So then with my experience in CCRE, by my sophomore year, I was able to acquire 3 different executive board positions at Seton Hall. And then from there, continued on to become the president of the Black Student Union for the past 2 years. And as a result of that, I was able to promote community service to our constituents, like within the Black community. And like now you see that the Black Caucus has a relationship, the Black Caucus being all of the Black organizations at Seton Hall, including the Black fraternities and sororities. But now through BSU, the Black Caucus is able to go to Westside High School on Friday evenings and go to their Lights On program, which is a time for getting students, regardless of whether or not they go to that high school, out of the streets on a Friday evening, and just like allowing them to relax and have fun. By this semester, and it's so unfortunate that the semester got cut short, but by this semester, we actually started going back to Westside during the day throughout the week. It would either be a Thursday or a Tuesday, depending on the week, but we would go out once a week during the day, and then on that Friday for Fridays would be Lights On, but then like during the day we would actually speak to the students about college readiness and then like all of our experiences. So it would be like a light mentorship. And then because of that relationship that we built having fun with them, like during the first semester at Lights On, the students were able to become more comfortable with us. And then that's when they started to open up a little bit about like what they want to do. And a lot of times, people don't go to that school, and it's literally not even 15 minutes away from Seton Hall. And so it just made me wonder, like why we as Black students aren't even doing enough for them. So then we started to build that relationship. And I got to see like my own peers, like who go to Seton Hall, like execute their leadership skills and truly like serve these students and become passionate about it. And a lot of students, because of these interactions with the mentees and things like that, are taking on other leadership roles now. And I truly think that taking any kind of servant leadership experience gives you that opportunity to like truly grow as an individual. And then like I do have Dove up there because I know that Dove also has a lot of different community service opportunities, and you can take that opportunity as well to try to exercise your servant leadership skills. But I just don't know too much of it or too much about it because of my relationship with CCRE. But if you have any questions outside of this, please don't hesitate to reach out to me because I'm always excited to talk about servant leadership. Thank you. Dr. Pritchett, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Now I'm back on.
All better. There we
Thank you so much. We want to thank everyone for their very sincere participation. So we looked at 3 different angles on how we all can do better as Americans. One is understanding not only the past, but look at how, as it was pointed out by Megan, look at how the rich traditions of each of the immigrant groups who come to this country are very 3-dimensional. Sometimes we are encouraged in America very subtly to look at only at one dimension, what we want to see, the way we want to see others. But that's something I appreciate. I took from Megan's presentation, and then Zach brought us to the point of looking at how do things begin to change. Well, they begin to change when we actually challenge the status quo. We can't see the status quo, but there are pressures on all of us to think alike, not to think outside of the group, not to get out of our comfort zone. But Zach really encouraged us to understand and use the fullness of our mental and thinking capacities, so that indeed we would end up being critical thinkers, which means we don't accept the status quo. We know there's a better way, but we have to present the best of ourselves. And then Taylor just demonstrated that once you start that process, that you're interacting, you move off campus, you look at issues which are all around us, and you become involved. And she indicated that through that process of engagement, she has emerged as a probably more confident and a more committed leader who's there to service and help others. Everyone, we like, on behalf of the Petersheim Expo Committee, we want to thank everybody for tuning in and being with us for the past 90 minutes. We trust that we have planted seeds in your life, and I would like to add that if any of you would like to continue any of this discussion, because I noticed through some of the comments coming through, we were getting invitations to link up with others. But if any of you have additional questions or other resources you wish to point out, or you'd like to form some partnerships, please send me an email to that effect, forrest.pritchett@shu.edu, and I would be very happy to continue this as a partnership. So on behalf of our committee, we thank you all for being with us. And we would say during these times of crisis in the country, we have nothing to fear if we engage ourselves, network, bring joy to others, and peace to the world. Thank you so much. And until the next time we meet, everybody be safe, be at peace. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.